The sound that stayed with Eleanor Marsh was not the argument, not the cold, not even the particular quality of the morning light across the frost-hardened grass of the Colorado Valley. It was the sound of a door latch, one clean final click, the kind a man makes when he has already decided everything that matters and simply needs the mechanism to confirm it. She stood on the porch of the house where she had lived for 6 years, listening to that sound travel through the wood of the door and into her sternum, and understood that some sounds carry more weight than the whole of the silence that follows them. The Caldwell brothers had not raised their voices. That was the thing Eleanor turned over in her mind as she stood there, the thin November air pressing against her face and neck and the backs of her hands. Daniel Caldwell, her husband's eldest brother, had spoken across the kitchen table the way a man speaks when he is relaying information he considers settled. Their brother was gone. The land was theirs. The child had not lived. There was no name to carry forward, no line to preserve, no reason that a practical family could point to for keeping a widow in a house that belonged to the Caldwell estate. He had not called her wicked or lazy or unwanted. He had said something harder than any of those words. He had said they had made a practical decision. Margaret Caldwell had stood near the stove and looked at the floor. She was not a cruel woman. That was the worst of it. She was a woman who understood how things worked and had long ago made her peace with understanding the way people make peace with weather or debt. Eleanor had not wept. She had looked at Daniel Caldwell's hands around his cup of coffee, the steadiness of them, and had known that weeping would change nothing and would cost her something she could not afford to spend. She went upstairs, rolled her wool blanket into a tight cylinder wrapped inside it, the dented kettle, the knife with the worn bone handle, and the envelope of cash she had kept sewn into the lining of her winter coat for 3 years. $32. She had pressed it flat against her ribs every cold morning since the year the harvest came in thin, and she had first understood that a woman's security was exactly as solid as the goodwill of the men around her. She came downstairs with the blanket across her back and the cracked shovel in her left hand. The shovel had belonged to her, bought with her own wages from 2 summers of taking in laundry. She had used it to turn the kitchen garden every spring, and its handle had developed a split along the grain that she had wrapped tight with strips of leather. It was not a good shovel anymore, but it was hers, and she took it. The door closed behind her. The latch caught. She stood still for one full breath, listening to the sound fade into the open air over Ash Creek Valley, and then she turned north and began walking. The frost lay across the grass in thin sheets that crunched under her boots and released a smell like cold iron. The sky overhead was the pale, washed-out white of early November in Colorado, a sky that made no promises and offered no warmth. She kept the creek on her left and walked with her eyes on the sandstone ridge ahead, its bands of red and copper and pale ochre, catching what little light the sun put out this time of year. The ridge was the landmark she needed. What she was walking towards sat beneath it 3 miles north and 1/4 mile up a slope of loose shale and dried bunch grass, and the only reason she knew it was there was that she had found it 4 months ago by accident, following a stand of serviceberry bushes up a drainage draw in September, when she had still been a woman with a house to return to. She had stood in that shallow alcove in the sandstone for perhaps 10 minutes in September, her basket of berries at her feet, pressing her palm against the back wall and feeling the particular stillness of deep stone. She had noted the angle of the cliff above it, the way the opening faced south and southeast, the dry floor, the absence of seepage marks on the ceiling. She had noted all of this the way you note something your hands recognize before your mind is caught up. Then she had picked up her basket and gone home, and she had not spoken of it to anyone. She had not forgotten it either. By the time she reached the creek's edge, where the bank dropped down to the water, the cold had worked through her coat and into the muscles of her shoulders. The creek ran shallow here, maybe 8 inches deep at the center, but the current moved fast enough to have kept a lane of open water through the ice that had formed along both banks overnight. She needed to cross. The stepping stones she knew from summer, were hidden under the ice shelves, and she misjudged the third one, her right boot breaking through a shelf of ice and plunging into the water to above the ankle. She caught herself on the shovel handle, kept her balance, and got to the far bank without falling. Her boot was soaked through. She climbed up onto a flat-top boulder above the waterline and sat down and pulled off her boot and her stocking. The money. The money was sewn into the coat lining, not the boot, but the cold shock of nearly losing her footing had sent a current of pure fear through her that landed on the envelope of bills anyway, and she reached inside her coat and felt for the cloth pouch just to confirm. Her fingers found it, dry, $32 still there. She wrung out her stocking against the boulder and spread it across the stone in the weak sunlight. Then she spread her boot beside it, sole up. She sat in her coat with one bare foot tucked under her opposite knee and watched the stocking steam faintly in the cold, and understood with a completeness that had no room for argument that this was what her position actually was. One wet boot, one stocking drying on a rock, $32 that she could not spend until she reached a town which she could not reach safely in winter without shelter first. She was at the beginning of a chain of problems in which each one had to be solved before the next one became solvable. And the first problem was that she needed to be under stone before dark. She was back on her feet in 20 minutes, boots still stiff and damp, but no longer dripping. She crossed the open ground between the creek and the base of the ridge at a pace that kept her warm enough to ignore the discomfort, and she climbed the shale slope with the shovel balanced across her shoulders and her eyes on the sandstone face above. The rock changed color as she climbed the pale yellows of the lower formation, giving way to the deeper reds above, the kind of red that looks warm from a distance and as cold as anything when you press your face against it. She found the drainage draw she remembered from September and followed it up to the left, and after another 10 minutes of climbing, she came around a shoulder of rock and the alcove was there. It was smaller than she remembered. She stood in the opening and turned around slowly. The ceiling cleared her head by perhaps 8 inches at the highest point, which was good. The floor sloped left to right by a noticeable degree, which was a problem. The opening faced south-southwest exactly as she had remembered, which was the most important thing. The back wall was dry, the stone unmarked by the dark stains of water. The overhang above the entrance was solid, a single unbroken shelf of sandstone 2 feet thick, extending out over the opening like a brow. She pressed her palm flat against the back wall and held it there. The stone was cold, but not wet. Cold, not the cold of a place water had worked through recently. It was the cold of dry mass, the deep, steady cold of rock that had been out of direct sunlight for months and held its temperature the way stone does uniformly without the variance of air. Her grandmother Agnes had called this kind of cold honest cold. You knew exactly where you stood with it. It would not surprise you. Agnes had grown up on a farm in the hill country of Western Virginia, in the part of the Appalachians where the ridges ran close together and the hollows between them stayed shaded most of the winter day. Her people had built in stone because stone was what the ground gave them, and they had learned over generations the particular language of rock. Not mysticism, observation. Which layers split clean along the horizontal and which crumbled. Where to drive a wedge to open a face without bringing down what was above it. How to lay a dry wall so that the weight of the upper stones pressed the lower ones tighter rather than pushing them apart. Agnes had taught Eleanor with her hands, not with words, the way you teach someone to swim. You put them in the water and you show them with your own body what the body can do. Eleanor had grown up watching Agnes build and rebuild the stone walls of the farm's south pasture every spring, resetting the stones that frost heave had shifted over winter. By the time Eleanor was 12, she could read a stone wall the way some children read books, could see at a glance where the builder had made a mistake and where the wall would fail in another season. She could feel in the placement of a single stone whether the person who set it had understood the logic of the thing or was only imitating its appearance. Then Agnes died when Eleanor was 17, and the farm went to Eleanor's uncle, and Eleanor left Western Virginia and went west because west was the direction that young women with no inheritance and no particular plan went in those years if they were willing to work and not easily frightened. She landed in Denver in the spring of 1873, 19 years old, with $7 and a knowledge of stone walls that had no obvious market value in a city that was busy building itself out of timber. But 3 years later, she was hired as a records clerk at a granite quarry operation southeast of Denver. And for the 3 years she spent in that work, she learned from the quarrymen a second language of stone, more technical than Agnes's, less embodied, but precise in its own way. She learned to read the drill marks on a rock face and understand what they said about the grain of the stone. She learned that certain kinds of sandstone, the dense, fine-grained varieties, could hold heat in their mass the way a clay brick did, absorbing warmth slowly and releasing it slowly, making them useful for heat storage if you understood how to exploit the property. She learned the difference between a fracture that would propagate under pressure and one that had reached its natural terminus and would hold indefinitely. That particular distinction, learned from a taciturn quarry foreman named Elias Grubb, who had been blasting rock in Colorado for 20 years, would matter more than anything else she knew before the winter was finished. She left the quarry work in 1879 to marry Thomas Marsh, who had a homestead claim in Ash Creek Valley and needed a woman who understood hard work more than she understood comfort. She had been happy enough in the way that practical people are happy when the work is honest and the ground produces and the person beside you in the dark is not unkind. Then Thomas died of fever in October of 1886, and the child she had been carrying for 7 months did not survive the shock of that grief, and she was left with a house that did not belong to her and a family of in-laws who had been decent enough while Thomas lived and had now made their practical decision. Standing in the alcove above Ash Creek Valley on that first morning of November, Eleanor looked at the sloping floor and made herself stop feeling and start thinking. She had perhaps 5 hours of useful daylight. The floor had to be level before anything else mattered, because a level floor was the foundation of everything that would come after. She set her bundle in the right corner of the alcove, propped the shovel against the wall, and took off her coat. The shovel's cracked handle held when she drove it into the packed earth of the floor. Barely. She felt a split flex and settle on every stroke, and she adjusted her grip each time to keep the pressure off the damaged section. The earth inside the alcove was denser than she had expected, packed by time, and the occasional animal that had used this place for shelter before her, and every stroke of the shovel sent a jarring impact up through her wrists and into her elbows and shoulders. She worked from the high side of the slope, cutting down and moving the displaced earth toward the low side building, up a rough level from the back wall outward. The mathematics of it were simple enough, but the labor was not, and after an hour her hands had reopened at the old blisters from the creek crossing and were bleeding lightly into the shovel handle. She had no gloves. That was a thing she had not thought to take from the Caldwell house, and she would not let herself think about it now. She folded the cuffs of her shirt down over her palms and kept working. By midday, she had a rough platform, perhaps 6 feet square, at the back of the alcove, level enough to sleep on without rolling. The earth she had moved was piled at the entrance in a low berm, and she looked at it and then at the line of the cliff and thought about wind. The prevailing winter wind in this valley came from the northwest, which meant it would strike the cliff face above the alcove at an angle and deflect upward before it reached the entrance. The berm needed to be higher on the left side to redirect any wind that got underneath that deflection. She reshaped it with her hands and boot until the profile looked right, then stepped back and studied the entrance from outside. The light was already beginning to lean toward the southwest. She had 3 hours, maybe a little more. She went down to the creek. The creek bed at the base of the slope held flat limestone pieces in a range of sizes, deposited by some older and higher water that had moved through this drainage before the creek found its current channel. Eleanor moved along the bank with her apron folded into a carrier, picking up pieces one at a time and turning them in her hands. She was not looking for the biggest stones. She was looking for the flattest, the ones with two parallel faces that would sit level on a course and present a flat top for the course above. She was looking for the ones with no visible cross-grain fractures, the ones that had spent long enough in the water to reveal whether they were sound or hiding a crack that would open under pressure. Her hands knew what they were searching for before she could have put it into words. She selected 17 pieces in the first pass and carried them up the slope in two loads, her arms burning on the second climb. She set the first course dry without mortar because she had no mortar, and because dry set stone laid correctly did not need it. The wall would be held together by weight and the geometry of contact, each stone pressing against its neighbors, so that any lateral force on one was distributed across several. Agnes had built the south pasture wall this way for 40 years, and it had never moved more than frost heave required. Eleanor fitted the first stone to the ground at the left edge of the entrance, flat face up, and felt for its stability before releasing it. Then the second fitted tight against the first with the seam between them offset from the seam below by 4 inches. No two vertical joints aligned. That was the rule Agnes had never let her forget. Every straight line through a wall was an invitation for the wall to open along it. She had the first 2 courses laid before the light began to go. 6 inches of wall across a 4-foot entrance width, low enough to step over easily, but beginning to be something. She looked at it in the fading afternoon with a shovel in her hand and mud packed under her nails, and felt something she did not have a precise name for. Not pride. Something more animal than pride. The recognition that a body could do what it decided to do if it ignored everything except the task directly in front of it. She ate a piece of hard bread from her coat pocket, standing in the entrance, looking out at the valley going dark below the ridge. The creek was a pale line in the dimness. The cluster of buildings that made up the settlement was a scatter of yellow window lights a mile south. She could see the Caldwell barn from here, which she had not anticipated, in which she decided to find neither painful nor significant. It was a structure in a landscape. She was a different structure in a different part of the same landscape. She went inside, spread her blanket on the leveled floor, pulled on her coat over her shirt, and lay down with her boots still on. The stone at her back was cold through the blanket and coat both, but the wind that had picked up at dusk was running north along the cliff face, and the alcove cut the worst of it. The difference between wind and no wind at this temperature was approximately the difference between difficult and impossible. She filed that observation away and closed her eyes. She did not sleep immediately. The cold was specific and deliberate in the way it worked through her blanket, finding the places where the fabric pulled thin over her hip bone and shoulder and concentrating there. She shifted and shifted again, pulling the blanket edges up and tucking them, finding a configuration that reduced the exposed surface area without cutting off circulation. This was a solvable problem. She solved it. What she could not solve was the sound from above her head. It started perhaps an hour after full dark, just as she had moved into the shallow edge of sleep. A sound like a single knuckle cracking high and clear in the silence of the alcove. Then nothing. Then 20 minutes later, another sound from the same location, slightly different in pitch, a lower resonance that came and went so quickly she almost doubted it. She lay still with her eyes open, looking up at the ceiling she could not see. She had not examined the ceiling closely enough in the remaining light of the afternoon. She had been focused on the floor, the entrance wall, the practical construction of habitation, and she had let herself glance at the ceiling and find it adequate without pressing her hand against it and reading it the way she would have if she had been fresher and less hurried. Now in the dark, she was adding up what she had actually seen. There was a fracture. She had registered it peripherally, a diagonal line across the right third of the ceiling, running from somewhere near the back wall toward the front right corner. She had seen it and made a rapid judgment that it was stable and moved on. The judgment had been based on a glance. Elias Grubb, who had taught her to read rock faces at the Denver quarry, had told her that fractures in sandstone fell into 2 categories, propagating and terminal, and that the difference between them was visible if you knew what to look for. A propagating fracture showed fresh surfaces, pale where the rock had separated recently, and often had visible gaping at one end where the crack was still working. A terminal fracture was dark along its edges, stained by years of contact with air and the slow chemistry of the stone, and it did not gape, but lay closed and still. She had seen the fracture. She had not determined which kind it was. She lay awake for a long time cataloging what she knew and what she did not know. She knew the stone above her was sandstone, the dense red variety, not the crumbly tan type that made up the lower formation. Dense red sandstone was stronger in compression than any load a winter snowpack could put on it. She knew the fracture ran diagonally, not horizontally, which meant it was not a bedding plane separation of the kind that could produce a slab fall. She knew she had not felt any looseness in the rock when she pressed her hands against the walls and ceiling shared the same formation. She knew the sounds she had heard were consistent with thermal contraction, the natural movement of rock cooling rapidly after a day of intermittent sunlight, a phenomenon she had heard in the quarry faces on cold evenings. What she did not know was whether the fracture was terminal or propagating. She would look at it in the morning. That was all she could do. She could not look at it in the dark, and getting out of her blanket to stand under it with her eyes closed and her hands on cold stone would tell her nothing that daylight could not tell her better. She made herself hold this reasoning and stop the cycling of the question, which was a discipline she had practiced since the year after Thomas died, when she had found that her mind in the small hours of the morning had a tendency to take any uncertainty and expand it until it filled the available space. You could not think your way to certainty about things that required daylight and physical evidence. You could only decide to wait for the conditions that would make certainty possible. She slept somewhere in the middle of the night. Not well, not deeply, but enough. Dawn came into the alcove at an angle that surprised her. The south-facing entrance caught the first low light of the November sun across the valley rim and threw it directly into the back of the alcove, and Eleanor woke to a stripe of pale gold across the stone of the right wall and understood that she had oriented herself correctly. The morning sun would enter this space every clear day of the year. In winter, when the sun tracked low across the southern sky, that light would reach all the way to the back wall. In summer, the overhang above the entrance would shade most of it out. The alcove breathed with the seasons in exactly the way she needed it to. She rose and stood under the fracture and looked at it in the new light. It ran across the ceiling from a point about 3 feet from the back left corner to a point near the front right edge of the overhang, a diagonal of perhaps 6 feet. She stood on her toes and pressed her thumb against its surface at the midpoint. The edges were dark stained, the amber-brown color of long oxidation, and the crack itself was narrow, consistent across its length, without the widening at one terminus that indicated active propagation. She moved her thumb along it for 2 feet and felt no gaping, no fresh, pale surfaces. She pressed hard enough to feel the stone resist, and it resisted absolutely without any flex or give. Terminal. The fracture was old and still and going nowhere. She put her feet flat on the floor and breathed out slowly and noticed that she was breathing out something more than air. She had been carrying the question of this ceiling since the moment she lay down the night before, carrying it in the particular tightened way you carry something you are afraid to set down because you are not sure what it will do if you release it. Setting it down now felt like setting down a stone she had not known she was holding. The floor of the alcove was her. The wall she had begun at the entrance was her. The ceiling fracture was not going to fall on her, and the alcove was going to be sufficient, and what had kept her awake for most of the night was a verdict she had already reached in the afternoon and simply failed to trust. She went to work. The second day was about clay and water. She needed clay for the heater she was already planning in the back corner, and the best clay was on the far bank of the creek, a smooth gray-brown deposit she had seen in September, just downstream from the stepping stones. Getting to it meant crossing the creek again, and she was not going to break through the ice shelf a second time. She spent the better part of the morning solving this problem with materials at hand, And the solution was a short length of rope she had wound around her bundle, a wooden barrel stave she found wedged in the rocks downstream, and 15 minutes of work with her knife. She lashed the stave horizontally between two creekside willows at water height, making a brace she could lean against while reaching over the ice shelf to scoop clay from the far bank with the kettle. It took 4 crossings and 4 kettle loads, and her shoulder ached from the awkward angle. But by midday, she had enough clay piled inside the alcove to start thinking about the heater in practical terms. The heater was the center of everything. A woman could tolerate cold that was merely cold, the kind of cold that required more blankets and more layers and more careful management of activity levels. But the temperature that Colorado delivered in its serious months was not merely cold. It was the kind of cold that found a body and worked on it from the inside once the body stopped generating enough heat to counter it. And the only reliable counter to that temperature in a closed space was stored heat in thermal mass, not a fire. Fires in enclosed spaces were how people died. A heater built correctly was a different thing entirely. You burned your wood in short, hot, complete combustion cycles that sent the heat into the surrounding stone mass and left no unburned gases to accumulate. The stone then released that heat slowly for hours after the fire was out, warming the air without burning it. She scratched the design on the floor with a stick while she ate her remaining bread. A firebox at the back raised slightly off the floor on a stone shelf to protect the clay below it from direct heat cycling. A channel running forward and down from the firebox, turning 90 degrees and running back toward the rear wall. Before rising to a vent hole, she would cut through the upper right side of the alcove near the ceiling. The hot gas would travel this path before exiting, surrendering its heat to the surrounding clay and stone at every bend. The vent would exit outside the alcove below the overhang, angled slightly downward to prevent rain entry, and positioned on the eastern side where the prevailing wind would create a slight draw. She stared at the design for a while, checking it against what she knew. The draw was the critical uncertainty. A vent that drew correctly would pull combustion gases out reliably. A vent that did not would fill the alcove with smoke and carbon. She would not know if her draw calculation was correct until she lit the first fire, and she would not do that until the heater was fully cured, which would take at least a week of slow drying after construction. She was building toward a deadline she could not see clearly, the arrival of serious cold, and she was building with incomplete information about one critical variable. This was the condition she was working in. She accepted it and moved on to the next step. She spent the afternoon on the entrance wall pulling more stone from the creek bed. By the time the light went, she had the wall up to her sternum across the full width of the entrance, with the door opening left to the eastern side where the morning light would enter first and the prevailing wind would work least effectively against a person coming and going. She fitted each stone tightly, running her thumb along every seam and pressing any that showed daylight from the outside. 3 stones she rejected and carried back down the slope to the creek because they had invisible fractures she felt under thumb pressure, thin lines of weakness that would open in freeze-thaw cycles and loosen the wall from the inside. The wall she was building had to last the winter without maintenance. She could not afford to repair it. On the 3rd day while she was working, bent at the waist, fitting a long flat capstone along the top of the 3rd course, she heard the hoofbeats. She heard them before she saw the rider, the particular rhythm of a horse walking a loose shale slope, and she straightened and looked down the trail without stopping her hands. The man who reined in his horse near the base of the slope and looked up at her work was Thomas Hale. She knew him by reputation more than by acquaintance. He had spent 12 years surveying rail routes through the Rockies before taking a land claim in the valley, and he was known as a man whose judgments were slow to form and hard to revise. He sat in the saddle studying the half-built wall with an expression that was not hostile but was deeply unconvinced. And then he dismounted and tied his horse to a juniper and came up the slope. He stood at the base of her unfinished wall and looked at it carefully the way an engineer looks at a structure he has been asked to evaluate. Then he ducked his head under the stone overhang and came inside. He looked at the leveled floor, the clay pile, the scratched design on the ground, the bundle in the corner. Eleanor kept her hands on the stone she was fitting and waited. His voice when he spoke was level and unhurried, a voice accustomed to delivering assessments in field conditions where emotional responses were considered a waste of time. Mrs. Marsh, tell me you're not planning to winter in this place. Eleanor set the capstone and pressed her thumb along the seam. I'm planning to survive in it. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the walls. He walked to the back of the alcove and pressed his hand against the stone, which was what she had done and what any person who knew anything about stone did when they wanted to understand it. He turned and looked at the scratch design on the floor and was quiet for a moment, working out what it meant. Stone holds cold, he said, not as a challenge, as a statement of what he considered fact. Eleanor reached for the next stone without looking up. Stone also holds heat. He made a short sound through his nose that was not quite dismissal, but was close to it. He gestured at the entrance wall, at the open sky above it, at the bare shale slope below. He said what he had come to say, without particular cruelty, covering the absence of timber, the absence of help, the absence of tools adequate to the task, the absence of everything a structure in Colorado needed to survive serious winter. He said it the way a man says things he considers obvious, fully expecting them to land as obvious. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Then she asked, the man you found in the hanging valley east of Copper Ridge 3 years ago, the one who tried to winter in a rock shelter, where did he place his fire? The stillness that came over Thomas Hale's face was the particular stillness of a man who has been asked a question that connects to something he has been carrying for a long time. He said nothing for a moment. The wind moved along the cliff face above them with a low, dry sound. Center of the space, he said finally. Eleanor set her stone. That's why he didn't come through. Thomas Hale stood in the alcove for another minute looking at the clay pile and the scratch design and the stone wall rising across the entrance. He looked at her split hands and the way she held the shovel and the arrangement of the floor, which told a story about the decisions that had been made before he arrived. He looked at all of it and said nothing, which was a different kind of response than saying something. When he left, he walked down the slope at the same deliberate pace he had come up, and Eleanor watched him reach his horse and mount and start back down the creek trail. At the place where the trail curved around the big cottonwood, 30 yards from where she could no longer see him, his horse slowed to a walk, and he turned in the saddle and looked back up at the alcove once before the cottonwood took him out of her sight line. She registered the look, filed it, turned back to the wall. The afternoon light moved across the sandstone face above her in the slow, particular way it moved in November, the sun tracking low and the shadows falling early on the north-facing surfaces, while the south faces held the light long past what the temperature would suggest. She worked in the last good light until her hands were unreliable from cold and fatigue, then sat in the entrance of her unfinished wall and ate the last of the bread and a handful of dried berries from the bottom of her bundle. The valley below held its end-of-day quiet, the kind of quiet that settles when wind stops and animals are working their way to wherever they spend the dark. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys in the settlement, thin and straight in the still air, which meant the cold was consistent and the air was not moving, which meant tomorrow might be clear. She needed clear days. Clear days meant sunlight in the alcove for the drying of clay and the warming of stone, and sunlight on the creek bank for reading the limestone beds she was drawing her wall stones from. She lay down on her leveled floor that night and looked up at the fracture she had examined in the morning and had not thought about since. Terminal, old, and still. She had looked at it with her full attention and read it correctly, and the reading had held up against the first test of a cold night and a day of work. She had nothing from the Caldwell house, and $32 in a damp cloth pouch, and a shovel with a cracked handle, and whatever she had brought with her from Agnes's hill country teaching, and 3 years of watching quarrymen read stone. She was building in the right place. The fracture was not going to fail. The heater design was sound. The wall was rising. Outside in the dark valley below, a coyote called from somewhere along the ridge, and the sound came down the cliff face and arrived in the alcove, changed, flattened, stripped of its edge by the rock. Eleanor listened to it and thought about how the same stone that would protect her from wind and cold was already beginning to change the quality of the sound that reached her, and there was something in that worth holding. She pulled the blanket up and lay still in the cold that was honest cold. The cold you knew where you stood with and waited for the dark to move toward morning. On the morning of the sixth day, she found the stones gone. She stood in the entrance of the alcove looking at the space where she had arranged 17 selected limestone pieces the evening before laid out in order of placement for the next morning's work. And the space held only the scuff marks of their removal and a set of boot prints she did not recognize. Large, wider than her own, the print of a man's work boot with a worn heel that left a distinctive shallow impression on the left side. The prints came up the slope from the creek trail, stopped at the stone arrangement, and returned the same way. No other disturbance, just the absence of her stones and the evidence of someone who had come specifically for them. She stood with the cold of early morning pressing against the back of her neck and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but occupied the territory between them. She had selected those 17 pieces across 3 separate creek runs, carrying them up the slope in loads that had torn the skin of her forearms against the rough limestone edges. Each one had been tested for soundness and geometry. The work of replacement was not an afternoon's inconvenience. It was the better part of a day she did not have to spare. She went down to the creek. She did not allow herself to spend the walking time constructing theories about who had taken the stones or why, because theories without evidence were a form of expenditure that returned nothing useful. She went to the creek and began again running her thumbnail across each candidate piece, tapping with the shovel handle, listening for the hollow sound that meant hidden fracture. An hour into the work, she found a limestone piece twice the size of anything she had previously selected, a single flat slab that would serve as a capstone for the entire upper right section of the wall, and its discovery felt like the kind of accidental return that comes when you stop mourning what was taken and return your attention to what is available. She did not read it as compensation. She read it as what it was, a piece of stone that had been there all along and that she had not been ready to find before. She carried it up the slope in both arms with the weight against her chest. The shovel left at the bottom for a second trip, and she set it in the entrance of the alcove and looked at it and then at the wall and understood that the person who had taken her stones had also inadvertently sent her back to the creek at a time when the water level was slightly lower from 3 days without precipitation, exposing a limestone bed she had walked past twice without examining. She did not offer this observation as a reason to feel grateful. She offered it as evidence that the situation was more complex than it appeared, which was true of every situation she had ever been in. Clara Whitfield came on the 9th day. Eleanor heard the horse on the lower trail and looked up from the heater's second clay course to see a woman picking her way up the shale slope on a gray mare that was better suited to the valley floor than to loose rock. Clara Whitfield was perhaps 30 years old and wore a dark coat with a fur collar that announced her father's prosperity without meaning to, the way things announce what they are when no one has thought to conceal it. Her father owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and had a reputation for fair dealing that coexisted without apparent tension with a separate reputation for knowing exactly where the line of his obligations ended. Clara dismounted at the flat rock below the alcove and tied the mare to a scrub oak and came the rest of the way on foot carrying a wicker basket in the crook of her arm. She stopped at the partial wall and looked at it and then looked at the alcove behind it, and her expression moved through several things before settling into something that Eleanor could only describe as careful. Not cruel, careful in the way of a person choosing their words more deliberately than usual, because they have already decided what outcome they want and are working backward from it. She set the basket down just inside the entrance, not extending it, not handing it, setting it down the way you set something down for an animal you are not sure will approach giving it the option of coming to the offering rather than receiving it. Eleanor watched this happen and noted it and kept her hands in the clay mixture. Clara said what she had come to say, and she said it more gently than it deserved to be said, which made it harder to answer. There was a wash house at the Whitfield property. Something could be arranged. A woman alone in a rock shelter in Colorado winter was a thing that did not need to happen when arrangements were possible. The word arrangements did a great deal of work in the speech, covering everything that the speech declined to specify, which was the particular kind of arrangement that ended with a widow attached to someone else's household in a role that had no name, because naming it would require admitting what it was. Eleanor's hands were in the clay, and the clay needed attention, and she gave it the attention it needed while she answered. She said what she believed coal did not trouble itself with social categories, and a woman alone should live, which was a different objective than a woman alone should be comfortable, and the difference between those two objectives was what she was building. Clara heard this and looked at the wall, and at the heater base, and at the scratch designs still visible on the floor, and something in her face shifted from the careful expression to something less settled, less certain. Not agreement, the absence of the certainty she had arrived with. She left without taking the basket. Eleanor ate from it that evening, sitting on the floor with her back against the rear wall. Bread, salt, pork, a small jar of apple preserves sealed with wax. She ate methodically and without embarrassment, because hunger was a condition and food was its remedy, and the fact that the food had arrived as an expression of condescension did not alter its nutritional content. The preserves were very good. She noted this with a directness that felt close to defiance, though there was no one present to defy. 3 days after Clara's first visit, Eleanor returned from a creek run for water to find the clay on the firebox base had developed a hairline crack along its eastern face. Not deep, not structural. The kind of crack that forms when the surface dries faster than the interior in low humidity conditions, which was the condition of a Colorado November with no precipitation and a wind that pulled moisture from exposed surfaces continuously. She pressed her thumbnail into the crack and measured its depth at less than a quarter inch. She mixed fresh clay with additional water to a slightly looser consistency and worked it into the crack from both ends, pressing slowly to eliminate air pockets, then covered the entire face with a damp cloth she had cut from the hem of her underskirt and weighted at the edges with small stones. The crack was a problem she had been prepared for. Agnes had cracked chimney clay every other year and had repaired it every other year with exactly this method, and the repair held as well as the original if done correctly before the crack widened beyond its initial hairline state. Eleanor had caught this one early. That was the difference between maintenance and crisis catching things before they became the other kind of thing. She was replacing the damp cloth 2 days later, checking the repair in the late afternoon light, when she heard hoofbeats on the lower trail again. These were quicker than Thomas Hale's measured pace, and they stopped lower on the trail, and when she straightened and looked down the slope, it was Clara Whitfield again on foot this time, no basket climbing, with a purposefulness she had not shown on her first visit. She was looking for something. She moved along the slope to the left of the alcove entrance, eyes down, scanning the ground with the focus of a person who has lost something specific and is reconstructing the path they took when they had it. Eleanor watched her for a moment and then looked at the bottom left corner of the entrance wall, where she had placed a small, heavy object as an additional anchor for the hide she had been testing as a temporary door covering. The object was a gold ring. She had found it on the shale slope 5 days ago on one of her creek runs, half buried in the loose rock just above the main trail, and she had pocketed it without examining it closely because the light was going and she had water to carry. She had looked at it properly only that evening, turning it in her fingers near the small fire she had lit outside the entrance. A woman's ring plain band, the kind of ring that meant something specific. She took it from the wall corner now and walked down the slope to where Clara was searching. Clara looked up and saw the ring in Eleanor's outstretched palm, and the expression that crossed her face was not relief or not only relief, it was something that arrived behind the relief and was harder to look at directly. She took the ring and held it in her closed fist for a moment, not putting it on. Her eyes moved from Eleanor's face to the alcove entrance and back. I thought I'd lost it on the way down from my first visit. She opened her hand and looked at the ring. My husband's been gone 2 years. I don't know why. I still wear it. Eleanor said nothing because the statement had not been a question and did not require an answer, and because she understood the particular irrationality of holding on to the symbols of a life that had ended before you were ready for it to end. She understood it in the way you understand things you have not resolved, which was completely and from the inside. Clara looked at her with the directness of someone who has been embarrassed and has decided to be direct in response rather than retreat into formality. The things I said about arrangements. She stopped. Then I'm not sure I meant them the way they sounded. Eleanor looked at her steadily. I think you meant them the way your father would have meant them. That's not the same as meaning them yourself. Clara held the ring in her palm and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it on her finger and went back down the slope, and Eleanor watched her reach her horse and mount and ride south without looking back, and thought that the woman who descended the slope was not quite the same woman who had climbed it, which was sometimes what honesty did to people when they encountered it unexpectedly. The heater took shape through the second and third weeks of November with a slowness that measured every cold morning against Eleanor's calculation of how many cold mornings remained before the temperature made outdoor work impossible. She built the channel walls in short sections, letting each section cure partially before adding the next, and she built the upper cover stones into the channel roof with the same dry fit precision she used on the entrance wall, fitting each piece until the seam was tight enough to hold heat and loose enough to allow for thermal expansion without cracking the structure apart. She had seen a firebox crack from thermal expansion once at the Denver quarry, a small experimental masonry heater one of the engineers had built to test stone behavior under heat cycling, and the failure had been spectacular and instructive. The structure had to be able to breathe while retaining its integrity. These were not contradictory requirements if you built with the right tolerances. She cut the vent hole in the upper right wall of the alcove on the 16th day using the knife in the corner of the shovel blade in alternating passes, scoring the sandstone along a 4-inch square, and then deepening the cuts until she could break out the first piece and work from the inside of the opening outward. Sandstone cut more easily than limestone but shed grit continuously, and she worked with her face turned aside at each stroke and her eyes narrowed. And by the time the vent was through to the outside, her hair was pale with stone dust, and her eyes felt lined with it. She blew the dust from the vent channel with a series of sharp breaths and looked through the opening at a thumbnail-sized circle of gray November sky and felt something tighten in her chest that was not emotion, but was adjacent to it. The heater was nearly done. The question of the draw was nearly answerable. She spent 2 days finishing the vent channel exterior, cutting a slight downward angle into the outside face, and fitting a small stone hood above the opening to deflect direct wind without blocking the natural draw. She had calculated the hood angle based on the wind behavior she had observed across 17 days of living on this slope, the way the northwest wind deflected off the main cliff face and lost most of its force before reaching the alcove area, arriving as a gentler, more variable air movement than its origins suggested. The hood needed to work with that gentler movement rather than against the main force. She fitted it and looked at it from below and adjusted the right side by 1/2 inch, and looked at it again and decided it was as correct as she could make it without testing. On the 18th day, Clara came back a third time. No basket, no ring, no apology requiring completion. She came up the slope in a plain coat without the fur collar, and she came all the way to the entrance and stood in the doorway and looked at the finished heater with its vent channel and the channel cover stones and the raised firebox shelf and the accumulated work of nearly 3 weeks visible in every surface of the structure. Eleanor was mixing the final sealing layer for the firebox exterior when Clara arrived, and she kept her hands in the clay and let the silence extend until Clara had finished looking. You built all of this. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement people make when they are recalibrating something they had previously measured incorrectly. Eleanor looked at the heater. I built what winter requires. Clara moved into the alcove and examined the vent channel and the channel cover stones, and ran her hand along the firebox exterior, the way Thomas Hale had run his hand along the entrance wall, the gesture of a person trying to understand something through contact rather than observation. She looked at the entrance wall, in the shaped berm in the drainage trench Eleanor had cut along the base of the right side wall to direct any water that entered away from the sleeping area. She looked at all of it with the expression of a person dismantling a prior conclusion. Then she said what she had come to say, what the fall of her expression made clear. She had thought about since the day on the slope with the ring. She said that a woman alone was something people in this valley had an opinion about that had nothing to do with the woman herself, and that she had carried that opinion as if it were her own when it was not, and that the wash house and the arrangements had been her father's idea delivered through her mouth, and she had known it was wrong and it had gone anyway because going was easier than the alternative. Eleanor pressed the last ceiling layer smooth along the firebox base and looked at Clara directly. "You came back 3 times. Most people don't come back once." Clara was quiet for a moment. The wind outside moved past the entrance with a low seeking sound. "I came back the 2nd time for the ring. And the 3rd time." Clara's voice was quiet, directed at something she had been working toward for weeks. "Because I've been thinking about what you said, about a woman alone should live. And I think I've been confusing living with being comfortable for a very long time." Eleanor looked at the heater she had built with cracked hands and inadequate tools, and clay pulled from a frozen creek bank by a system of rope and an oak stave. She looked at it and thought about what it had cost and what it would return. Comfortable is something you can lose in a single night. Alive is something you build toward every day. Clara left as the light began to fall, picking her way down the shale slope in boots that were better suited to drawing rooms than mountainsides, and Eleanor watched her descend without satisfaction or resentment. The woman had come 3 times, and each time she had been more honest than the time before. That was a kind of movement, even if it was slow. She spent the following week completing the entrance. She had saved a buffalo hide from a summer kill, rolled tight against moisture, and stored under the rear wall of the alcove, and she hung it across the door opening. From a horizontal pole, she fitted into notches cut into the top of the entrance wall on each side. The hide was heavy enough to hang straight without nailing, and she weighted its lower edge with stitched leather strips to keep it from lifting in the wind gusts that came irregularly in the second half of November. The edge of winter gusts that did not yet have the weight of the full cold behind them, but were practicing. She was adjusting the hide's lower weighting on the morning she saw what the birds were doing. She had grown up watching her grandmother Agnes watch birds, not because Agnes was given to symbolism or sentiment, but because birds responded to pressure systems before barometers did, and a person who paid attention to birds got more warning than a person who paid attention to sky alone. The flock that lifted from the creekside cottonwoods as Eleanor descended the slope was moving south at midday, which was wrong for this time of year, and they were flying low below the ridgeline, which was what birds did when a pressure system was pushing them down. The individual birds at the edges of the flock kept changing direction, slightly testing the air, and the whole flock had an urgency to it that was different from the ordinary movement of late fall. Eleanor stood on the slope and watched until the flock disappeared around the southern bend of the valley, and then she looked at the sky above the northern ridge. The overcast was the color it was supposed to be for early December, flat, gray-white, nothing unusual in its appearance. But there was something about the quality of the light through it, a flatness, a deadness that her body responded to before her mind had processed it. She had perhaps 3 days, maybe 4. She had been calculating her wood supply against a window of time that ended at the first serious storm, and her honest count was that she was short by 2.5 days of gathering. She went back up the slope, left the water at the alcove, took only the shovel and a length of rope, and went back down to begin cutting wood. She worked through the remaining daylight and into the early dark, carrying loads up the slope until her legs stopped bending reliably at the knee, and she had to sit on the flat boulder above the creek and wait for the muscle to resume its function. The wood she was cutting was mostly dead juniper from the slope above the trail, dry and dense and good for the short, hot burns the heater required, and she limbed it with her knife and the shovel blade and cut it into lengths by scoring and breaking over the boulder. It was not efficient. It was what she had. She had increased her woodpile by a day and a half of supply. When the cold sharpened overnight on December 20th, and the sky on the morning of the 21st had the flat wrong look she had first seen 4 days ago, now more pronounced, the clouds low and heavy, and moving faster than the wind at ground level, suggested they should be. She was inside with the hide pulled across the entrance, and the heater laid and ready to light when the storm arrived. It did not announce itself gradually. It arrived the way certainty arrives all at once, and complete the wind coming down Ash Creek Valley in a single sustained roar that hit the cliff face and split around it, and the sound of it was enormous and structural, the sound of weather that has decided something. The hide across the entrance snapped taut against its pole, and the lower weighting pulled straight, and the whole surface vibrated at a frequency Eleanor felt in her back teeth. She moved to the heater and struck the tinder with the flint she kept in her coat pocket and fed the kindling in the sequence she had worked out over 2 weeks of small experimental fires. Thin, dry grass first, then twigs of ascending diameter, the whole thing building toward the first piece of dry juniper that would begin the actual burn. The tinder caught on the second strike. She fed the fire in careful increments, watching the smoke at the top of the firebox opening, feeling for the moment when the draw would take hold and begin pulling the combustion gases through the channel rather than letting them back into the alcove. The wind outside changed direction twice in the first 10 minutes, the gusts coming at varying angles as the storm settled into its full pattern, and each direction change altered the pressure at the vent exterior, and she could feel the effect at the firebox opening, the pull strengthening and weakening and strengthening again. On the 14th minute, the smoke stopped hesitating. It moved with purpose, curling up into the channel opening and disappearing, the draw established and steady, and Eleanor held her position crouched before the firebox for another full minute to confirm the draw was not going to fail when the next gust hit. The gust came, the draw held. She added the first piece of juniper and watched it catch and felt the first wave of heat move outward from the firebox opening toward her face, and she kept adding wood in careful increments for the next 40 minutes until the burn was complete and the firebox held only coals. She pressed her palm against the exterior face of the channel cover stones. Warm, not hot. Warm the way a living thing is warm from the inside out, the heat moving through the mass rather than sitting on its surface. She kept her palm there and felt the warmth increase incrementally as the heat worked deeper into the stone, and she understood with her hand what she had only understood with her mind for the past 3 weeks, that the thing she had built was working. Outside, the storm reached its full voice. The wind hit the cliff face above the alcove with a sound like freight, and the snow it carried did not fall, but drove horizontally visible in the narrow gap at the bottom of the hide as a white continuous rush. Something large cracked in the valley below, a timber or a branch or something built by human hands that had trusted wood over stone, and the crack carried through the air, even under the noise of the storm, and arrived in the alcove as a single telling note. Eleanor fed the heater a second short burn, 2 hours later, and a third at midnight by the quality of the dark, and between burns she lay on her blanket in the warmth that the stone was giving back from its accumulated mass, and listened to the storm doing what it had decided to do. And the alcove held its temperature with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the fire, which was out, and everything to do with the stone surrounding her, which was not. On the second morning, the fracture on the ceiling made the cracking sound she had been waiting for since the first night. It came once sharp and clean in the hour before the storm began to ease, and Eleanor sat up and looked at the ceiling and waited. The sound did not come again. The crack did not widen. The stone had spoken in its own language about the pressure the snow above was exerting on the formation, and then it had returned to silence, which was what terminal fractures did when they were finished being terminal. The storm eased on this morning of the 23rd, the wind dropping so suddenly that the silence arrived like a physical substance, pressing into the spaces where the noise had been. Eleanor lifted the hide at the bottom edge and looked out at a valley remade entirely in white, the familiar shapes of the settlement buildings visible only as altered geometries under accumulated snow, and the particular geometry of Thomas Hale's roof, showing the telltale sag of timber that had been asked to carry more than it was designed to hold. She let the hide fall back and turned to the heater and felt the channel stones which were still holding the last of the previous night's burn, and thought about what Thomas Hale would think when he walked his claim in the new silence and looked at his roof. She was replastering a small area of the firebox exterior where the thermal cycling had raised a minor surface blister when she heard boots in the snow on the trail below. She stood with her hand on the warm firebox stone and listened. The boots were unhurried, deliberate, a single set coming up the slope with the careful steps of someone who knew the shale was under there and was not in a hurry to find it with their feet. Thomas Hale pushed the hide aside and ducked under the entrance lintel and stood in the alcove with his beard carrying the remnants of the cold and his eyes moving across the space with the comprehensive attention of a man who has spent his professional life reading structures. He looked at the entrance wall, the shaped berm, the drainage trench, the heater and its channel system, the vent hole high in the right wall, the buffalo hide hanging from its notched pole, the shaped sleeping area along the rear wall, the stored wood racked above the floor against the left wall. He looked at all of it and did not speak for a full minute. Then he looked at Eleanor, and his voice carried something she had not heard from him before, a quality that sits below the register of tone and above the register of content. I lost most of my east roof section. The ridge beam failed at the collar tie. Eleanor looked at him. He was not here to report damage. He was here because he had walked his broken roof in the new silence and understood what the broken roof meant about a question he had answered incorrectly in November. I need to ask you something. He looked at his boots, which was a thing Eleanor had not seen him do before, and then he looked back at her with the steadiness of a man who has decided to be honest even when honesty requires him to occupy an uncomfortable position. If there's another one coming, and I think there is, would you let me come here? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. This was the same man who had called her alcove a hole in a cliff. The same man who had taken her, selected stones from the slope in the dark of a November night, believing that inconveniencing her enough would make her seek the safety of someone else's arrangement. She had known it was him since the morning she found the boot prints. The worn heel print, the specific size of trail that came from the creek path where his land bordered the water. She had known, and she had said nothing and gone back to the creek and found better stones. How many did you take? The stillness that came over his face was the stillness of a man who has been found out about something he believed he had concealed. He did not try to deny it. That Eleanor thought was something. 17. You'll bring back 17 in the spring. Sound one's flat-faced from the limestone bed below the cottonwood. He held her gaze and nodded once, the nod of a man accepting not just the terms but the weight behind them. This place was built for surviving, Eleanor said, and her voice held nothing that required him to be diminished in order for her to be correct. Not for keeping score. Thomas Hale stood in the warmth that the stone had stored from the previous night's burn in the alcove above Ash Creek Valley that had held through the first storm of winter without a single stone shifted from its place, and he looked at the woman who had built it with a cracked shovel and $32 and knowledge borrowed from the dead. Something moved across his face that was not quite shame and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. He left before midday, his boots crunching back down the shale slope, and Eleanor watched him go from the entrance and then let the hide fall back across the doorway. The sky to the north had the color and weight of the sky that had not finished with this valley. She looked at it through the gap between the hide's edge and the entrance wall, reading what it was telling her, and she thought about all the ways she had built correctly and the single variable that remained uncertain, which was how much more the winter had decided to do. The sky answered her on the 14th of January, going green at noon. The green lasted 3 hours before the color deepened into something that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of weather. Eleanor had seen storm light in Colorado before the particular yellow-gray that preceded hail in summer, and the flat white that preceded snow in early winter. But this was neither of those. This was the color of pressure made visible, the sky compressing itself toward the ground, as if the atmosphere above had decided to weigh something and had chosen this valley for the measurement. She stood at the entrance of the alcove and looked at it for 60 seconds, reading what she could read, and then she went inside and began preparing for a storm that was going to be worse than the first one. She checked the wood rack first. 22 days of supply by her account calculated against 4 short burns per day, which was the rhythm she had established through the first storm and the weeks following. She checked the water barrels, both full from a creek run 3 days prior. She checked the hide fastenings, tightening the lower leather weights and adding a second anchor point on the left side where she had noticed a slight lifting tendency in crosswinds. She checked the vent exterior through the upper wall opening, pushing her fingers through to confirm it was clear of ice formation, which it was. She checked the firebox, cleared the ash from the previous burn, and laid fresh tinder and kindling in the sequence she no longer had to think about consciously. She was resetting the firebox stone shelf, where one corner piece had shifted slightly from thermal cycling, when she heard the footsteps in the snow outside. And these were not the deliberate single-set steps of Thomas Hale navigating shale. These were multiple sets, one moving with purpose and two moving with the uncertain rhythm of people being guided rather than going independently. Thomas pushed the hide aside with his shoulder because his hands were occupied. His right arm was around Clara Whitfield, who was moving with her eyes partly closed against the wind and her left hand pressed over her mouth. In Clara's arms, her face buried against her mother's shoulder, Nell was making no sound at all, which was more alarming than crying would have been. Snow had crusted in Clara's hair, and along the shoulders of her coat, the good coat with the fur collar that was now dark with moisture, and her boots, the ones Eleanor had watched navigate the shale slope 3 times without difficulty, were packed with snow to the ankle. Thomas's voice came through the sound of the wind outside, which had risen in the time Eleanor had been checking the alcove interior, risen to the kind of register that stops being heard as wind and starts being heard as weather making a decision. The chimney came down inside. Smoke backed into the whole house before we got them out. She can't go back tonight. He looked at Nell. The girl breathed some of it. Eleanor did not calculate the complications of 4 people in a space built for one. She calculated them and moved past the calculation in the same motion. Because calculation without action was a form of paralysis she had trained out of herself in the months after Thomas Marsh died, and the child had not lived, and she had learned that the mind could manufacture reasons to be still, indefinitely if you gave it permission to. She pulled the hide wide and brought them in one at a time. Thomas first, so his hands were free, then Clara with Nell, and she let the hide drop behind the last of them and felt the storm's leading edge cut off as suddenly as a door closing. The alcove was immediately different. 4 people breathing in a space calculated for one person's respiration changed the air chemistry within minutes, adding moisture in quantities that the single vent she had cut was not designed to manage. She knew this before the condensation appeared on the entry wall. Stones knew it from the basic arithmetic of breath in enclosed volume, and she crossed to the vent and used the knife handle to widen the upper aperture by a ½ inch on each side, breaking away the sandstone carefully to avoid disturbing the draw geometry. The draw held through the modification. She cut the width of the next planned burn by 1/3 to compensate for the additional moisture load. Clara had gotten herself to the rear wall and was sitting with Nell in her lap. The child's face now visible, her color better than it had looked in the first seconds. Nell's eyes were open and tracking. She coughed twice shallow coughs and pressed her face back into Clara's coat. Thomas stood near the entrance with his hands at his sides, reading the alcove the way he had read it in December, checking the integrity of a structure he had previously assessed incorrectly and was now reassessing with the particular attention of a man who had paid a price for his first error. Eleanor crouched before the firebox and struck the flint. The draw established itself in under 5 minutes, the fastest she had achieved, and she understood that the widened vent aperture was contributing to a stronger natural pull than the original configuration had produced. She filed this for future reference and fed the fire in careful increments, watching the channel opening for any hesitation in the smoke's movement, finding none. The heat began moving into the firebox stone mass within the first burn, and she could feel it at the channel cover stones inside of 20 minutes. The warmth building from the firebox outward through the structure in the slow, irreversible way of heat stored in mass. Nell had stopped coughing. She was watching Eleanor from the shelter of Clara's arms with the particular attention of a child who processes unfamiliar things through observation before language. Her eyes moving from the firebox to the channel stones, to the vent hole, to Eleanor's hands and back again. She said something into her mother's coat that Eleanor did not hear clearly, and Clara bent her head to listen, and then looked up with an expression that Eleanor could not immediately categorize. "She wants to know why it isn't smoky," Clara said. "She says the fire at home always made smoke in the room." Eleanor looked at the child. "The smoke goes a long while before it gets outside. It leaves its heat behind before it goes." Nell considered this with the seriousness children bring to explanations that connect to something they have recently experienced in a way they did not understand. Then she put her face back against Clara's shoulder and appeared to sleep, which was the most useful thing she could do. The storm outside reached its full expression in the hour after dark. The wind that struck the cliff face above the alcove was not the sustained roar of December 21st, but something more intermittent and therefore more violent, coming in waves that built to peaks that made the stone above the entrance hum at a frequency Eleanor had not felt in the first storm. She checked the ceiling fracture by lamplight in the first hour of the storm, pressing her palm along its length, feeling for any change in the temperature differential that would indicate movement. The stone was uniformly cold along the fracture line, no warmer at any point than at any other, which meant no friction, no movement. She took her hand away and did not check it again. Thomas had positioned himself near the entrance, sitting with his back against the wall and his legs extended, watching Eleanor with the expression of a man who has revised a significant judgment and is still working out the implications. He had said very little since arriving. He was a man who processed things in silence, and she had learned this across their conversations and had nothing to add to the learning now. The first burn ended, and she waited the interval she had established through practice 2 hours from the end of each burn before beginning the next, which allowed the channel stones to distribute the captured heat evenly through the mass before the next increment was added. She had enough wood for the night and the following day and into the morning of the day after. After that, the calculation became dependent on when the storm ended, which was not a variable she controlled. Clara spoke in the second hour of the storm after Nell had settled into sleep across her lap, and the alcove had reached the temperature Eleanor associated with the heater at its normal operating rhythm, not warm by domestic standards, but warm, the way a living body is warm adequately and from the interior outward. Clara's voice was low calibrated to Nell's sleep. "My father came to the house this morning, before the chimney fell." She looked at Nell's face, her fingers moving slowly along the child's hair. "He said he had been watching what you built, and he wanted to know if any of the south-facing ridge formations on his property could be developed the same way. He wanted to ask you directly, but he thought you might not speak to him because of the wash house." Eleanor looked at the firebox, opening the coals, radiating their diminishing light. "He can come ask. He didn't build any of this." Clara's hand stilled in Nell's hair. "He just owns the ridge." The distinction Eleanor heard in this was not resentment. It was a daughter working out the difference between proximity to knowledge and possession of it, which was a thing she had apparently been working out for some time and had reached a conclusion about recently. Eleanor said nothing because the conclusion was Clara's to arrive at in her own order and did not require confirmation from outside. The storm peaked at some point in the middle of the night, the wind reaching an intensity that produced a sound Eleanor had no prior reference for a sound beneath the wind sound, a subsonic pressure that she felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. Something gave way in the valley below during this peak, a deep structural collapse that traveled through the ground and arrived in the alcove as a vibration through the stone of the floor, brief and decisive. Thomas opened his eyes when it happened and looked at Eleanor, and she shook her head slightly, meaning she did not know what it was meaning. They would find out when the storm permitted, finding out meaning there was nothing useful to do about it now. Nell slept through the vibration. Eleanor fed the heater at midnight, and again before the gray light began, and once more when the light was established enough to read the hide surface by watching for the slight easing of pressure against it that would indicate the wind beginning to shift. The shift came in the 7th hour of the second day, not a sudden drop, but a gradual declension. The wind losing its peak intensity and settling into a lower sustained register, the hide surface going from taut drumhead vibration to a gentler, more rhythmic pressing. She had 2 days of wood remaining. She had not spoken this calculation aloud. Thomas had moved from the entrance at some point in the night and was now sitting near the channel cover stones with his right hand resting against the warm surface, his face carrying the expression of a man who is learning something through his palm that he had declined to learn through his ears in November. He had not complained about the cold. He had not complained about the floor. He had done what Eleanor had done for 3 months, which was accommodate discomfort as a condition of the available situation and get on with the business of being alive in it. "I've been thinking about the collar tie," he said, meaning the roof beam, that had failed in December and taken the east section of his roof with it. "I put it in at the angle the plan specified, standard pitch for this elevation." He looked at the channel stones. The plans didn't account for the way snow loads behave on a south-facing slope after a hard freeze. The weight distribution shifts as the snow consolidates. Eleanor looked at him. The plans were drawn somewhere else. He held her gaze. Yes. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm released its hold on the valley with the abruptness she had learned to expect from Colorado weather, which did not moderate but simply stopped, leaving behind a silence that pressed against the eardrums like its own kind of pressure. Eleanor lifted the hide and looked out at a valley that the storm had edited severely. The snow was deeper than December by a foot, at least the flat surfaces of the valley floor obliterated, under a continuous white that eliminated the distinction between ground and the lower slope of the hills. The settlement was a series of altered profiles, roof lines shifted, and in 2 cases, absent the shapes of familiar structures made strange by the weight of what had accumulated on them. The structural collapse she had felt through the floor on the first night was visible from the alcove entrance as a flattened geometry where a barn had stood at the lower edge of the Whitfield property. The roof had come down intact, the whole structure compressing under the accumulated load and settling flat into the snow around it, and the particular completeness of the failure had a quality that Eleanor found more sobering than the scattered damage of December. That barn had been built well by local standards. It had simply been built for a different kind of winter. Thomas came to stand beside her at the entrance. He looked at the valley for a long time without speaking, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath rising in the still air. Then his voice came from beside her with a quality that had nothing defensive in it, nothing qualified, nothing that was protecting an earlier position. This was no ordinary season. Eleanor looked at the collapsed barn, at the altered roof lines, at the creek that was invisible under its covering of snow, at the valley her husband's family had farmed for 6 years, and that had never looked like this in her experience of it. The winter doesn't adjust itself to what we were expecting. It does what it decides to do. He stood beside her for another minute and then went to check the exterior of the vent channel and the condition of the berm in the drainage trench because he was an engineer, and looking at structures for damage was what engineers did after events that tested structures. And Eleanor let him look and said nothing and went back inside to begin the work of returning the alcove to its single-occupant configuration. Clara and Nell stayed 3 more days while the Whitfield house was assessed and the chimney damage was measured against the available repair materials. Eleanor shifted the storage to the upper wall recesses, to free floor space for sleeping, and she shaped two shallow body-length depressions in the soft earth of the rear wall area. She managed the air quality with the same vigilance she had applied during the storm, keeping the vent aperture sized to the current occupancy, burning short and hot, and never adding wood before the previous increment had fully completed its combustion. Nell followed Eleanor with the persistence of a child who has decided that a particular adult is the most interesting thing in the available environment. She watched Eleanor mix the clay patch for a section of firebox exterior that had developed surface checking from the storm's thermal cycling, asking questions in the direct way of children who have not yet learned to filter curiosity through social calculation. She wanted to know why the wall stones were different colors. She wanted to know why the smoke went one way and not another. She wanted to know how Eleanor knew where to put things. Eleanor answered each question without simplification, and Nell received the answers without apparent concern for the portions she did not fully understand, storing them in the way children store things they intend to return to later. On the second day of their stay, Nell picked up a creek stone from the floor beside the wood rack, a piece of flat limestone Eleanor had set aside for a repair, and turned it in her hands with a seriousness that was recognizably the gesture Eleanor made herself when assessing stone. Clara watched this from the rear wall and said nothing. On the third evening after Nell was asleep, Clara sat beside the cooling heater and looked at all the accumulated evidence of a winter survived by construction rather than luck. And she said what had been building in her since the morning she had found Eleanor's outstretched hand holding her ring on the shale slope. "I told people you were mad, not those words, but the same meaning." She kept her eyes on the firebox. "In October, when it was clear you were building up here instead of accepting help, I told people you couldn't be reasoned with." Eleanor was packing a small clay repair at the base of the left wall where frost had worked into a seam overnight, her hands moving in the methodical way of work that has been done enough times to run beneath thought. "I know. I said it because it was easier than saying I was frightened." Clara looked at her hands, then at Nell. "If you were mad, then what you were doing wasn't a choice I should have been capable of. It was just something a mad person did." Eleanor pressed the clay repair smooth and sat back on her heels. "And if I wasn't mad?" Clara met her eyes for a moment and then looked away, which was its own answer. She had come 3 times before the storm, and each time had been more honest than before. And this was the honest center of it, the thing she had been working toward through the ring and the wash house and the arrangements and all the careful language she had used to keep from arriving at this particular sentence. If Eleanor was not mad, then Clara had watched a woman build a winter shelter alone with a cracked shovel and had called it madness rather than look at what it meant that the building was possible, what it meant about the arrangements and the practical decisions and all the structures of the valley that kept women in wash houses rather than on shale slopes doing work that kept people alive. "What changed your mind?" Clara asked, and the question was genuinely open, genuinely seeking. Eleanor looked at the alcove around her, the level floor and the stone wall, and the heater and the vent and the sleeping area and the stored water and the racked wood. "Nothing changed my mind. I never thought I was mad, but I think the storm changed yours." Clara looked at her daughter sleeping and did not answer for a long time. Then her voice was quiet and without defense. "I've been deciding things based on what was comfortable to believe. I think that might be how most decisions get made." Eleanor gathered the tools she had been using and set them in their places against the wall. Comfortable is the first thing to go when weather turns serious. What's left after is what you actually believe. The Whitfield house was repaired enough for habitation on the 4th day, and Clara and Nell returned to the valley, Thomas guiding them down the icy slope in the morning light with a care that he had not shown anyone before the winter decided what it was. He came back up alone an hour later and stood at the alcove entrance. Eleanor looked at him from where she was resetting a stone on the exterior face of the entrance wall that had shifted under the freeze-thaw pressure of the storm. "I'd like to learn how you built the heater channel." He said it directly without preamble or qualification. "Not just look at it, understand the logic." She set the stone she was holding and picked up the next one. Sit down then. He sat on the boulder near the entrance, and she explained the channel geometry, the firebox position, the vent placement and its relationship to the prevailing wind, the clay mixture and its curing requirements, the thermal mass calculation that determined how long the stones held heat after the fire was out. She explained it without embellishment, without simplification, treating him as a person capable of understanding the full version of the information. He asked precise questions, the questions of an engineer working out a system, rather than the questions of a skeptic looking for flaws, and she answered precisely. When she had finished, he sat looking at the heater through the entrance opening for a while. If I had known this in October, I would have built differently. If you'd been willing to listen in October, you might have learned it. She said it without edge. It was simply true, and he knew it was true, and she had no investment in softening it. He looked at her and then looked at the valley below where the smoke from repaired chimneys was beginning to rise into the clear, cold air of a January afternoon. How do you carry none of it? The Caldwells, the people who called you mad. All of it. Eleanor looked at the wall she was building and thought about the answer with care. I had work to do. Anger would have cost me warmth I couldn't spare. February came in with a cold that was different in character from January's cold, less dramatic, but more pervasive, a cold that settled into the soil and the stones and the air and stayed without the interruptions of storm and partial thaw that had broken January into distinct phases. The temperature varied less. The sky held its flat gray ceiling for days at a time. It was the cold of a winter that had made its point and was now simply maintaining it. Eleanor developed a rhythm that had the quality of something built rather than something endured. She burned the heater twice daily, short and hot, and the channel stones held their accumulated warmth through the intervals between burns so consistently that the temperature inside the alcove varied by less than 10 degrees across a full day. She slept well. She ate what she had preserved and rationed it without distress because she had calculated the supplies correctly in October, and the calculation had held. The visitors began in the third week of February. The first was a man named Garrett, who had a homestead claim on the east side of the valley and whose north wall had separated from his east wall at the upper corner junction during the January storm. He came up the slope with his hat in his hands and his questions prepared, and Eleanor answered them at the entrance, showing him the berm and its shaping, the drainage trench, the entrance wall, and its courses, explaining the logic of each decision as she had explained the heater logic to Thomas. He nodded at the right points, asked 2 precise questions, and went back down the slope with the information he had come for. Then there were others. A woman named Frances who wanted to understand the clay mixture. A man named Douglas whose root cellar had flooded in the thaw that followed the January storm and who wanted to understand drainage. Reverend Aldous climbed the slope on a Thursday afternoon with the careful steps of a man whose knees had opinions about shale and stood at the entrance and pressed his hand against the warm channel stone and held it there before he looked at Eleanor. You put your faith in rock. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who had spent 40 years distinguishing between faith and certainty and had arrived at a respect for both. Eleanor looked at the wall she had built. I put my work in it. The rock did what rock does. He took his hand away and looked at the warmth fading from his palm. This valley has been humbled. That's not always a bad thing. Clara organized the larger teaching sessions without being asked because organizing people required a kind of social permission that Clara had by virtue of her family's position in the valley, and Eleanor did not. Clara went door to door in the second week of February and told people that Eleanor Marsh was willing to answer questions about stone construction and thermal mass and drainage on Thursday mornings at the Alcove, and the Thursday sessions drew between 6 and 12 people for the remaining weeks of winter. Eleanor taught without performance, answering what was asked, demonstrating where demonstration was clearer than description. And the people who came were mostly people who had spent the winter losing things, and they were ready to learn in the way that people become ready after loss without the resistance that comfort produces. Nathan Bowen came to every session but never asked a question during them. He was a man of perhaps 45, wide-shouldered and deliberate, who had lost his wife 3 winters past and worked his claim alone in a way that had a particular quality. Eleanor recognized the quality of someone who has reorganized their entire life around the work, because the work is what remains when everything else has been taken. He stood at the back of each group and listened with the complete attention of a man who was storing rather than processing, and he never spoke until the others had gone. He came alone on a Wednesday in late February, which was not a teaching day, and stood at the entrance until Eleanor looked up from the clay repair she was doing. He had a piece of paper in his hand that he held out toward her, and when she took it, she saw it was a rough sketch of the south-facing ridge below his claim, with careful notations marking what appeared to be 2 alcove formations he had located in the sandstone formation there. "I found these in November," he said, "before the first storm. I didn't know what I was looking at." Eleanor studied the sketch. The formations he had marked were larger than her alcove, deeper, with a more pronounced overhang based on his notation of the cliff profile. "These are on your property." "They are. I haven't touched them." He looked at the sketch in her hands. "I've been trying to decide what they're for." Eleanor handed the sketch back to him. "That depends on what the winter teaches you." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket and looked at the alcove around him. "It's been teaching me that I built for the winters I knew instead of the winters that were coming." March arrived with a tentative quality, the temperature still locked below freezing at night, but with a different pressure in the air during the days, a loosening at the edges. The creek began to sound different, more movement under the ice. The light changed its angle by a degree that was perceptible if you had been watching the same south-facing wall every morning for 4 months. Clara climbed the slope on a Thursday in late March without the group, without Nell, without the fur-collared coat she had not worn since the storm. She wore a plain wool coat and work boots, and she came up the shale slope with the ease of someone who had learned the footing over multiple ascents. She stood in the entrance and looked at Eleanor, and then looked at the alcove. "The house is repaired, the chimney is rebuilt." She moved inside and sat on the boulder near the heater, which held its afternoon warmth in the channel stones without current fire. "You could come back to town now. You've more than earned your place anywhere in this valley." Eleanor looked at the wall she had carved and shaped, the floor she had leveled, the heater she had built and tested and refined through a winter that had made every decision she had made either correct or instructive. She looked at the recesses she had cut for storage, and the sleeping area, and the drainage work, and the entrance wall that had not shifted a single stone through 2 blizzards. She looked at all of it, and it looked back at her with the completeness of something finished. "This is my home," she said, not with defiance, with the simple accuracy of a true statement. Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You feel nothing for the Caldwells, for all of it." Eleanor moved her hand along the channel stone, feeling the warmth that was still there from the morning, burn the heat the stone had taken in, and was giving back at its own measured pace. "I had work to do. There was no room in it for what I couldn't use." Clara held that answer the way she had held the ring on the shale slope in November, quietly, as if the pressure of holding it would tell her something about its weight. Then she looked at the valley below the entrance, where the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the creek was beginning its spring voice, and the broken and repaired settlement was putting its smoke up in the clear afternoon air. "Nell asked me yesterday if she could learn to build a stone wall," Clara said. "I told her I'd ask you." Eleanor looked down the slope at the limestone bed below the cottonwood still half buried in retreating snow, and thought about the stones that Thomas Hale had brought back in the first week of February, sound ones, flat-faced, 22 of them instead of 17, without comment or explanation. Nathan Bowen came up the slope 3 days into April with a small cloth sack. Eleanor was outside checking the drainage trench after the first significant melt runoff, and she straightened and looked at him. He held out the sack, and she took it and opened it and looked inside at the small, hard seeds lying against each other in the cloth, pale and unpromising in the way of all things that are before they become what they will become. "Apple seeds," he said. The south-facing slope below the alcove caught the right light. said he thought they might take if someone put them in correctly before the last of the cold left the deep soil. They went down the slope together and pressed the seeds into the earth at the base of the sandstone face, the soil giving under their fingers with the particular softness of ground that has been frozen hard for months and is releasing its compression, not yet warm but willing. The work was quiet and took perhaps 30 minutes, and neither of them said much because the work did not require it. When they finished, Eleanor stood with dirt under her fingernails and the smell of thawing ground in the air, and the April sun on the red stone at her back. Below the slope, the creek ran clear, the ice gone from all but the most shadowed bends of the north bank. Nell's laughter came from somewhere along the lower water, where Clara had let her go ahead, and it traveled up the slope and arrived at the alcove entrance without losing any of its quality, the cliff face carrying it clean, which meant the temperature in the air had shifted enough to change how the stone carried sound. Spring was in the rock before it was anywhere else. Eleanor went back inside and pressed her palm against the channel stone, and the stone was cool now, the last of the morning burn long since given to the air. But the deep-seated warmth that was the property of mass rather than fire was still there. The base temperature the stone held for itself through all conditions. The warmth that did not require tending. Below the slope, the valley was putting itself back together in the practical way of places that have no choice but to continue. Roofs were being rebuilt with better understanding of what snow could ask of timber. 2 men had begun clearing south-facing formations on the ridge east of the creek. The knowledge Eleanor had carried down from the slope on Thursday mornings was already part of what the valley knew, already woven into how it would meet the next winter. The latch sound that had traveled with her every morning for the first month had long since stopped arriving with the force it once carried. The latch had meant what it meant. She had built what she had built. Those 2 facts existed in the same validity without requiring resolution, and she had no further use for the distance between them. The stone at her back held the April sun at its own pace, patient and without urgency, giving warmth, not because it had been asked to, but because warmth was what it did with what it was given. The seeds were in the ground.